Giuliano, Jamie, welcome. Thank you very much indeed for coming along to join us today for a chat. You've both written about the strange new world, the brave new world that we're entering, impact of technology on our politics and the rest of it. And I just wonder whether we could start by doing the elevator pitch on where technology is taking our politics. A lot to boil down in a very short space of time. But if we could just kick off with that, because you've both had distinctive takes on this in your books. Jamie, you first. Where is technology taking our politics? Is it to a dark place?
Well, my own view is that in the future, those who control the most powerful digital technologies will have a great deal of control over the rest of us, and not necessarily through the traditional mechanisms of parliament and legislature and government, but rather by writing rules that the rest of us have to follow, like a self-driving car that won't go over the speed limit, by gathering data about us and using that to influence and manipulate us, and by controlling our perception of the world, by seeing which slice of reality we're presented with. Increasingly, this is all the remit of digital technology, and I think it's a pretty profound change in the way that we live together.
Giuliano?
Well, I focus in my book mostly on electoral politics, and I think the best description of the future of it is actually a Channel 4 analysis, but not a political analysis, but an episode of the series Black Mirror, which is called the Waldo moment, where you have this kind of blue little bear that insults all the candidates and then becomes a very popular figure, and actually at the end of the episode takes over. And that episode aired for the first time, it's an incredible coincidence, the 5th of February 2013, and it looked very far-fetched, but that same day there were elections in Italy, and the winner of those elections was a party called the Five Star Movement, which is exactly the political translation of Waldo. And it's basically the translation into politics of Facebook and Google and Netflix and all those algorithms, where you don't really have an ideology anymore, but you just engage people singularly by telling them what they want to hear. And your only goal is to engage them. So you engage people differently. No? Facebook is not necessarily about fake news or conspiracy theories. If you like Rainer Maria Rilke poetry, it will flood you with Rainer Maria Rilke poetry. But if it can engage you another way, through fake news or conspiracy theory or whatever, it will do that. And the new politics, it works the same way. And being Italian is not always an advantage, but Italy's been kind of the Silicon Valley of populism in so many ways. So we've seen it happen first there, and then we've seen it spread through Brexit, through the Trump election, through all kind of phenomena throughout the world. And it will be more and more like that.
So why should it be more and more like that? If we've got technologies and we've had great advances in how information has been spread in the past, from the printing press to newspapers, television, commercial television, everything else, why should it be the evil Svengalis who get to master this? Are they just the early adopters? Why has it panned out this way? Or is it that this technology uniquely plays into their game, as it were?
My own view is that it's because technologies have been developed according to the logic of the market. If you're trying to keep people engaged and keep their attention and get their clicks, because that drives advertising revenue and attracts more people to your network, your interest is in providing them with information which they find entertaining or titillating or scintillating, but it might not be information that's true or useful or valuable. So you have these technologies that are developing according to a commercial rationale, which is we want as many clicks as possible. Whereas in a healthy polity, you also have a flow of information which is governed by a political rationale, the logic of the forum rather than the logic of the market, that there needs to be a shared base of information that we all understand, certain principles that we can all agree on, certain norms of debate and discussion. But if you allow technologies just to be developed according to the logic of the market, then you can't complain when you end up with technological forums that don't look like a forum at all.
Giuliano, your book is looking at these Machiavellis or Svengalis who pull the strings and mastermind the new technology. Need it be them? Can't different people turn the technology to their own advantage? Are they just the people who pioneered it, or is it all destiny?
Well, they've been kind of some of the early adopters. Andrew Breitbart, founder of Breitbart News in the US, used to say, you know, we can't go on mainstream media because it's kind of ruled by the democratic media complex, and so we will really invest in the digital dimension, which is kind of a market far west, and we will heavily invest there. So they've been kind of fast and quite advanced in doing stuff. For example, during the German elections, if you Googled Angela Merkel, they had found a way for all the first websites that would come out would be talking about the betrayal of Angela Merkel on refugees, and that's, you know, that's stuff that you can do technologically, and the official Merkel campaign wasn't even aware of that. So there is a side where they're kind of cutting edge, those engineers of chaos, let's call it like that. On the other hand, I think that the other thing is these technologies are very good at conveying emotions and feelings, and they play on people's, engaging them through feelings. And I think mainstream politicians have often forgotten that side, which has always been a fundamental side of politics. Yeah? And these engineers of chaos, they've been very good at playing on feelings, fear, rage, all those feelings, and the other ones have been mostly answering with rational arguments, which play less well on these platforms. But that's been naive, because politics has always been about feelings. So I think there's also, of course, there's a regulation work to be done, but there's also a political work to be done by mainstream parties and forces to understand how to reconnect in an emotional way with voters, and that can be done.
But is it, you say politics has always been about emotions. There have been an awful lot of elections in Britain that have felt a bit like a spreadsheet, where people are just working out the tax advantage one side or another. I think in Canada, amongst other democracies, they more or less sort of publish the whole thing, and you work out where you are on the grid and then vote accordingly. Or at least in the past there have been elections like that. Isn't it just that this is an emotional moment that has coincided with the new technologies, and it isn't actually predetermined that everything is, as I think your book would suggest, going into chaos and hell in a handcart? I mean, is it really that predetermined? Is it an unhappy coincidence?
Well, first of all, I think there's a very clear connection between the technology and the emotional moments, because, I mean, these technologies, they really play on that. And it's been proved that, for example, there's a very clear connection between Facebook penetration and unrest in various areas of the world, and that's why authorities tend to even shut down Facebook at times to prevent epidemics and emotional epidemics from spreading unrest in certain particularly tense situations. So, but the thing is, as you say, it depends on the moment. But if you look at when populism was stopped the first time in the 30s, great political reformer Franklin Delano Roosevelt, what did he do? He did give a political answer to the request and the complaints that were coming from the voters, and that was the New Deal and all that stuff. But he also somehow managed to harness those new technologies And back in the days, it was polling, for example, which had been developed in the commercial sector, but was kind of new to politics. And then obviously radio. And he managed, you know, there was a political answer, but there was also a technological mastery answer. He mastered the technology that had been mastered by the nationalists in Europe, for example. We know what use the fascists and the Nazis made of the new technologies. So I think it's a learning process, and you can't leave the emotions out of the equation, because it's just such a fundamental part of what politics is.
Jamie, you think it changes, I mean, in your book, you're clear it changes the way, all the terms we use in political discourse, from liberty to everything. You think it's actually bigger than a moment in the cycle or anything like that, the technological changes we're seeing?
I mean, it's a difference of perspective. I mean, many writers look at the next election cycle or the next economic cycle. I am unashamedly trying to look at the next life cycle and saying, actually, what are the biggest technological changes that are coming around the corner? And that's not just social media, it's artificial intelligence, it's ubiquitous computing, it's robotics, it's nanotechnology, it's blockchain. We are living at a moment of extraordinary technological change, and I think at our peril we just focus on the latest incarnation of Facebook or Twitter, or who happens to hold the Oval Office at a given time. I'm sympathetic to a lot of these arguments. I mean, I would counter that certain more rational or rational-esque thinkers have also been elected in the age of social media. I mean, the Professor President Barack Obama did very well, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron. There are tools in the hands of politicians these days that are new, and I think it is right to say that Donald Trump, for instance, very effectively used social media in his campaign in many ways to manipulate people's emotions. I think that the way I look at it is slightly different, because I think that it's fundamentally about the way that we transmit information to people. And I know that in many respects we'd agree on this. What campaigns do these days is they try to gather as much information as possible about individual voters and communicate a message to them, often at an individual level, whereas previously it might have been done on a ward or a precinct or a constituency level, to present the candidate and their ideas in the most attractive way possible. It's said that Donald Trump had 5,000 data points about 200 million different Americans, and that enabled his campaign to, it is said, beam messages to individuals, which presented him, no doubt sometimes in a highly emotional or populist light, but to the people who he was trying to win over in the center, probably in a slightly different light. So the way that it's game-changing in political communications is that it is transforming the way that the center, the core, gets its message across to the exterior. But as you rightly say, Gary, I think we're really just at the start of a period of much bigger change, and these are just the first tremors of a new era in which really who manipulates and controls technology, and that might be political parties, it might be presidents and politicians, but it might not be, will have a great deal of political and cultural and social influence.
Can we learn anything from slow and sluggish, as it seems now, the Industrial Revolution, and how eventually certain sort of rampant forces were tethered and restrained by not sending children into factories and Clean Air Acts? And is there anything that we learn from that bit of history about how you can tether forces before they destroy certain values?
Look, it's a good example of a time where technology was developing very much according to commercial imperatives, to economic imperatives. It was clear that what was happening with industrialization was enabling massive economic growth, and it took a little bit of time for political and social and moral considerations to catch up. In that sense, I would hope that our era parallels that one. Where I would draw a slight distinction is that I see changes in digital technology as principally relating to the way that we store, control, and communicate information. So it's more like the invention of writing or the invention of the printing press. Those are the technological analogies I would draw, because whenever we've had great changes in the way that we communicate information, we've always had great political changes as well. It's not coincidence, for instance, that the first empires sprung up shortly after the invention of writing, or that political tumult, in Europe at least, followed the invention of the printing press. Whenever we change the way that we exchange information, big political changes follow. So those are the periods we should look to for analogy.
Does the, I'm thinking of the first factories spewing out smoke till the moment we actually properly cleaned up the air. There was 100 years in between or something. Will we cotton on faster and intervene faster and just get ourselves clued up faster?
I don't know the answer to that, and it's partly why I wrote the book. I mean, let's be very clear though, technology is changing much faster now than it did in the 19th century, and that it has really at any time in human history. The pace of change in many respects is exponential. We generate as much data every 2 hours now as we did from the dawn of time until 2003. And I think a lot of the time in public policy, we think in linear terms. We imagine history moving in a line like this, but technology is moving like this. And the whole premise of my book is that I don't think we're yet prepared intellectually, morally, politically for the way that we are changing the world. And that applies both to politicians, but also to the engineers and software developers and companies that are developing these technologies. We have to make them more responsible for what they do.
Are you optimistic about that, Giuliano?
I think it can be done, and I think history always showed that you had, I mean, cars were invented 40 years before the traffic light came along, you know? So whenever you have a technology that develops, especially in market conditions, then you have the regulation that follows, and it takes a while. So I'm quite optimistic. I don't know what Jamie thinks, for example, of what's being done at a European level. But I think that's been probably for now the biggest effort to start dealing with these questions when it comes to social media and new media, and you can see some kind of design that's now emerging from that, and it might have the cloud to actually change the dynamics when it comes to that specific sector. So we'll see what happens in the US as well. Now there are now several candidates that are moving forward and putting that on top of their agenda. And so I think, I mean, of course, a new electoral cycle in the US might also have a very big, not only influence on the American situation, but on the global situation when it comes to that. But I mean, on the other hand, yes, I think the very scary part is that you have real centrifugal forces at play. The whole dynamics of politics has changed. You know, before with mass media, you couldn't communicate to people one by one, and so you had to somehow find a message that would convince a majority of people, and so you would lean towards the center. I mean, politics would be centripetal in a way, you know, it would go to the center. And today, it doesn't work like that anymore. Today, you take Jamie, you take Gary, you find out what's touching them, and you make them really mad about that, you know, and you explain them that, for example, Europe or the establishment or whoever is responsible for that, even if there are two opposite reasons. I mean, you saw that in the Brexit campaign. There was one of those strategies that had the theory that you know, you discover why they're mad and why they're worried, and if it's animal lovers, you tell them that Europe doesn't protect animals well. And if it's hunters, you tell them that Europe protects animals too much. And, you know, and you tell, at the same time, you're saying him one thing and him the opposite thing. And it goes all towards a common goal. So that's a bit scary.
But that genius of segmentation, though, surely can't forever defy the laws of political gravity. If you've told two people two different things and one of them gets disappointed, or maybe in this case both of them, at some point they come back and get you, don't they? Or are the laws of political gravity been thrown by new technology?
I don't know about that. It's obviously much more difficult to maintain once you're in power, but what comes next? That's a question that I always ask myself. You know, of course there will be a backlash because those people can't really keep their promises most of the time, even if you don't have to forget that the number one promise is we're going to punish the establishment. And that's a promise that they keep the moment you vote for them. And the moment they're in power, the punishment of the traditional political elites and of the establishment has been realized. And that's a core promise of the populists.
Delivered on.
And so they deliver on that. So we don't have to forget that. But anyway, they can't deliver on many of their other promises. So of course, there's bound to be a backlash. But will it be going back to the good, tame old world of moderate politics and mainstream politics and centrist politics, or will it be a next stage that we don't know yet, but that will look very different from that? I tend to think it will be. This second option, but of course it's very difficult to say what it will look like.
It is very difficult, but I'm going to ask you anyway, Jamie. The political landscape in Britain. Let's narrow it down to. Here, 20 years from now, the two main parties sort of recognisably still there, or led by a populist leader who's had to attack in a certain direction to please people and grassroots and voters in some cases. Take a punt for me.
Well, I can barely predict what's going to happen tomorrow in Brexit rather than what's going to be happening in 20 years. What I would add to what Giuliano said is that what technology does is that it removes the mechanism which I think we all have in mind, which is that a policy is promised, whether a government delivers on it is seen and decided upon, and then another decision is taken. But look at what happened when large parts of the internet were calling for Barack Obama to show his birth certificate. He did, but a third of them still just don't believe it. And when you become polarized and when you become fragmented, you either just change the subject or you spin it in a certain way, and we lower our critical faculties to information which is inconsistent with the worldview that has been drummed into us. So that is a little bit scary, and it is a little bit different. In 20 years' time in Britain, I would be aghast if our political institutions look the same. My own view here is that we need to completely change the way that we fund politics, the way that we legislate. We need to get rid of the House of Lords and restructure the House of Commons.
State funding, was that you were thinking of?
I do think that, yeah. I just think the influence of money on politics is pernicious and always will be, and inconsistent with democratic principles. I just don't see why richer people should have more of an influence on the political process than less well-off people. If anything, it should be the opposite. I'd be very disappointed if the two main parties were still in situ in the same form that they were. Obviously, because of the way that our parliament is set up, it leans towards a kind of duality, but I'd be amazed if it was the same. Cliche, but I think what we need is leadership, probably from the outside. I think if a very, very strong and convincing person, perhaps, dare I say, harnessing social media and harnessing digital technologies in a smart way, was able to properly disrupt the way that politics was done, I think things could change very quickly. Because as it is with all movements, you need to reach a tipping point. We can see that the independent group haven't yet reached a tipping point, but a trickle has to, at some point, to become a flood. But I just don't think we in this country are institutionally prepared for the problems that are coming over the horizon, and I'd be incredibly disappointed if the genius that exists here wasn't in some way channeled to making our politics better.
Giuliano, you live in Paris,
yeah.
But Italy was your original home. What shape does Britain look like it's in to you, and where do you think we're going to be in 20 years' time? Some people might say...
Be gentle.
We went into certain elements of populism were obviously pushing for Brexit. Some elements were rather old-fashioned, traditional, conservative. There were all sorts of elements to that. But we went in first. We were early adopters in populism. Does that mean we come out of it quicker or go into it deeper? What's your prognosis?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't dare, obviously, but there's something a bit depressing, which is that in its many political convulsions, Italy has been looking at the British system for many years as a reference, and some people wanted to introduce a semi-electoral law, and there's been big debates about that. And we thought that the way things were going was that. We would look a bit more like you know, if we reformed, and which was utopic, but still. And what happened is exactly the opposite. No? So it's not only did we take a different way, but you are starting to look much more like us. And I think, unfortunately, you have to look at lots of Italian, not only Italian, but Italian political dynamics to see what's in the future. What scares me is that if you're a young person and you're being socialized to politics today, so you're entering politics for the first time today, compared to when I was young, there's lots of things that are in the debate, lots of words, lots of arguments that would have been unacceptable 20 years ago. You know, you couldn't have, I mean, a leading politician couldn't have lied to the camera and got away with it. He couldn't have said some xenophobic or some conspiracy things openly like they do today in Italy and in some ways in the UK as well. So if I look at it from the perspective of a 20-year-old that's now entering the field of politics just as a spectator, not as an actor, I think they've been socialized to a level of violence and verbal violence and of conflict that and of basic decay of some basic democratic rules and ways of engaging each other, and that leaves a mark because they're doing their political education now, and they're doing it in these conditions, and they will be conditioned by that in the future. So I'm not so optimistic about what is looming, not only for Britain but for Europe as a whole. But I fully embrace Jamie's idea that there was a political thinker that said, you know, the pessimism of knowledge and the optimism of will, and that's the whole point about political leadership. So of course, I mean, political leadership is about turning those circumstances around, so it definitely can be done in the UK, in Italy, and elsewhere.
I would agree with Giuliano that the greatest example of regulation of technology is the European Union. The General Data Protection Regulation, for instance, which imposes quite strict rules on what may and may not be done with data, affords a much greater degree of protection for people who live in Europe than, say, people who live in America experience. It might well be that it is because it is a slightly remote institution at the heart of the European central government that it has been able to take a slightly longer view of that, of competition and antitrust law. I'd be interested to see if there's any analysis of that, because it doesn't have to answer as quickly to the immediate political concerns as domestic governments do. But there are plenty of centrist leaders who use technology for their own ends. I mean, to go back to an example I used earlier, if you look at the 2012 Obama campaign, that was, he used tech in 2008, but in a very different way. 2012 was very much a data-focused campaign of a kind that wasn't massively dissimilar from what his opponents now use. So I don't think that there is a monopoly on technological exploitation by any particular group. It just so happens that in a few very high-profile instances recently, populists have done better with it. It may well be because they are predominantly emotional rather than rational.
Do you see good examples, Giuliano? People heard about the Obama example. Do you see any examples across Europe about people you might consider centrists or whatever, trying to take back these technologies and some of these issues and own them?
Well, I mean, you've quoted Macron before, and I think that at the very beginning, I didn't believe in when Macron came forward, because I thought he would be kind of too technocratic, you know, and I don't think you can win an electoral campaign with a technocratic argument today. But what did he do then? I mean, he revealed a side of himself that we hadn't seen. Actually, he did it in a very particular scene during a meeting, one of his first campaign meetings, where he like lifted his hands and screamed, and everybody and all the political commentators said, he's nuts, you know, he's lost his mind completely. But that was the moment when he kind of revealed something else about him, which is that he's a very good politician, actually. And he's not just, you know, a very competent technocrat, but he also has that other side. And he was able to do that very well during the campaign. Then, of course, again, it's easier done during a campaign than after when you're in power. The Gilets jaunes movement is an incredible movement because it's purely based on Facebook, you know. And the leaders of the movement that meet with the government or that are interviewed in the media, they're just the people who created Facebook groups that have more followers. And they say exactly the opposite thing from one another. It's really a fascinating example of the new politics. But the Macron experiment is really an experiment on how moderate mainstream leader can be in power and eventually keep power and be re-elected today. So it's going, I mean, we don't know which way it's going. Now again, for this great debate that's been done in France, technologies have been very important. There's been several firms that have helped take in all this million. There's been 1 million contributions of ideas and desires and whatever that have been taken into account in this huge, massive process. We don't know what will come out of it yet. There's a very big expectation in France now that everything will change, which sounds maybe a little bit unrealistic, so there might be a backlash and people might be disappointed in what comes out of it. But that's still a very interesting, the Macron experiment, I think, is still very interesting.
Just finally, I'd like to ask, when we look back a long time from now on the influence of technology on our politics, is it possible that it could be the social authoritarianism that we see in China developing, where you get sort of Uber scorings for your behavior and who knows what you are denied as a result? Could it be that that is actually the lasting impact and not necessarily a moment of populism that we're seeing in the Western world? Jamie?
Well, look, I mean, I think the great political question of this century is to what extent will our lives be governed by powerful digital systems and on what terms? And a lot of that will be shaped by the relationship between tech firms and the state. And there is a spectrum. At one end you have China, where there is almost complete alignment between the economic interests of a tech firm and the political interests of the state. Then you have, perhaps in the middle, more of a sort of commercial arrangement, like the one you have between the US government and data gatherers. So it's unconstitutional for the US government to conduct mass surveillance, but it's not unconstitutional for them to buy data that's been gathered by lots of little brothers rather than one big brother, as they do all the time. So there's a kind of arrangement or an alignment between them there. Likewise, if you search for child pornography on Google in the United States, your name will be automatically reported to law enforcement. The CIA doesn't own that technology, but it collaborates with it. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have instances where tech firms say no to the state and where they resist the encroachment of regulation or the encroachment of the government, like when Apple refused to give the password to the iPhone of the guy who was said to have done the San Bernardino terrorist attack. There is always going to be a spectrum, and those who call for more regulation have to remember that often more regulation just puts more power in the hands of the state, with the kind of social authoritarian consequences that you describe. So it's going to be about finding a balance, making sure that technologies in the hands of private sector players don't just develop according to corporate logic, but just have some degree of moral and political responsibility, but at the same time not giving all of the power of those technologies to governments.
Giuliano, similar question. I mean, I suppose what I'm saying is, will populism be a moment, not a new defining era? and actually we'll get a grip on it?
Well, I mean, that's a question that we would all like to find an answer to.
You're not very optimistic, though, are you?
I'm not extraordinarily optimistic. I think there's a cycle that's been opened now, which will play out in different ways in different contexts. So it might play out differently in the UK than it will play out in Italy, in France, or in Eastern Europe. But for sure, there's something that we kind of forgot about. I think maybe the most fascinating side of today's politics is that somebody like us, who grew up after World War II, you couldn't really. There's lots of stuff that happened before that, in the 20s and in the 30s, and of course you studied it in books, but you didn't really understand it. No, how could it be? How certain things could happen, and what's interesting about today is that now you can feel it, now you can understand it, and it doesn't mean that it will play out the same way. Of course it won't. Yeah? But some political movements now, they're going back to exciting those kind of instincts, those kind of desires, those kind of fears, and it will play out differently, but you know, it's that kind of cycle. So of course, again, I mean, we have history to teach us a few lessons, but history never teaches lessons to anybody, unfortunately. So I'm not necessarily pessimistic, but I think we're facing huge risk.
You've both taught us a lot, given us a lot to think about, to chew on. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.